The day my mother handed my sister a $750,000 house in Scottsdale and handed me a condemned mining property with $65,000 in unpaid taxes, she was smiling. Not apologetically. Not nervously. She was smiling the way she always smiled when she believed she had finally put everything into its proper place. My name is Layla. I'm 28 years old and I hold a master's degree in geology from the University of Texas. For 4 years, I've worked as an environmental consultant for energy companies across the Southwest, running soil surveys and mineral assessments on land that most people look at and see nothing. I look at the same land and see everything underneath it. My mother never understood that. To her, I was the daughter who chose dirt over law school. We were sitting in the conference room of our family's estate attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in October, me, my mother, my older sister Tamara, and Tamara's husband Holt. The room had pale carpet and framed diplomas and smelled like printer toner and the stale coffee sitting untouched in the center of the table. Our father had passed away 4 months earlier, and this was the formal estate distribution. My mother, as executor, had spent those 4 months deciding how everything would be divided. She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick envelope with a gold seal on the back. She placed it directly in front of Tamara and folded her hands. She announced that the family home in Scottsdale, the one my parents had owned for 22 years, now appraised at just over $750,000, free and clear, was being transferred into Tamara's name. Additionally, she said, there was $120,000 in a joint savings account transferring as well. Tamara made a sound I can only describe as a squeal wrapped inside a sob. She grabbed Holt's hand. Holt leaned back in his chair, looking like he'd just won something, and in a way I supposed he had. Then my mother reached back into her portfolio and pulled out a plain white envelope that had clearly been opened and resealed with tape. She set it on the table in front of me the way you'd set down something you didn't want to hold anymore. She said my father had purchased a parcel of land in eastern Oklahoma years ago as part of a business venture that never materialized. The property had been sitting idle, accumulating unpaid county taxes, and the total back tax bill now stood at $65,000. She told me I had 30 days to pay the taxes and keep the property active, or let it go to the county. I looked at the envelope, then I looked at my mother. I asked her if she was giving Tamara a $750,000 home free and clear while handing me a piece of land with a $65,000 debt attached to it. She didn't flinch. She said my father would have wanted Tamara, as the firstborn, as someone settled with a family and a husband, to have the stability of a home. She said I was young, educated, and more than capable of building my own future. She looked at me the way she always looked at me when she said things like that, like she was paying me a compliment and closing a door at the exact same moment. Holt cleared his throat and said, helpfully, that the land might be worth something if I cleaned it up a little. He smiled his flat smile and added that maybe working with dirt was actually my calling, given how many years I'd already spent studying it. Tamara didn't laugh, but she didn't correct him either. She never corrected him. I looked down at the envelope. I opened it slowly. Inside was a deed, a county tax notice, and a one-page property summary. The address was in LaFleur County, Oklahoma. The land was listed as a former surface coal mining operation, approximately 90 acres, zoned industrial, currently non-operational. And there it was, a small notation in the lower left corner of the summary sheet that my mother had clearly never understood the significance of. Property subject to prior environmental review, see attached federal correspondence. The attached correspondence was not there, someone had removed it. But I already knew what it said, because I had pulled the public environmental records on every piece of land my father owned when he first became ill, 3 years before he died. I knew exactly what was buried in that LaFleur County parcel, and I knew exactly why my mother wanted it out of her name. I kept my face completely still. I picked up the estate attorney's pen, signed my name on the transfer documents, slid them back across the table, and said thank you. Tamara and Holt exchanged a look, the kind between two people who believe they've just watched someone make a terrible mistake. My mother gave a small nod, the kind that said, this is exactly how I planned it. I walked out of that conference room with an envelope full of debt and a piece of condemned industrial land, and I did not stop smiling until I was 3 blocks away. The drive to LaFleur County from Austin takes about 6 hours. I left before dawn and arrived just after noon on a Thursday, following a county road that eventually gave way to a gravel access path overgrown with switchgrass and scrub cedar. When I stepped out of my truck, the smell hit me immediately, that specific metallic, acidic bite that comes from heavy metals leaching into soil. I've been on enough contaminated sites in my career to recognize it without testing. The land looked exactly like what it was, a stripped and abandoned surface mine. Barren plateaus of pale, compacted earth, standing pools of rust-orange water, a collapsed equipment shed with no roof remaining, rusted chain-link fence with the posts listing sideways. The sparse vegetation grew in discolored patches, a visual signature of acid mine drainage that I've documented on a dozen different sites. That evening, sitting in my truck with a laptop open on a mobile hotspot, I pulled up the EPA's public enforcement database and searched the property identification number. The results loaded in seconds. 11 documented violation flags going back 7 years. The most recent entry, dated 9 months earlier, was a formal notice of intent to issue a federal consent order. Translated out of regulatory language, the government was preparing to assign mandatory cleanup liability to the current legal owner of the property. The estimated remediation cost was $1.1 million. The notice also referenced a separate IRS flag for unreported environmental liability tied to the same parcel. If the owner failed to engage within the consent order timeline, the EPA had authority to pursue criminal negligence charges under CERL, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, the same law that has sent people to prison for exactly this category of situation. I sat in the dark with the screen glowing on my face and let myself understand the full shape of what my mother had done. She had known, she had to have known, she was the executor. Every piece of federal correspondence about my father's properties had come through her. She had removed the federal notice before sealing that envelope. She had handed me not an inheritance but a trap. She wanted me holding the cleanup liability and the criminal exposure so that Tamara could keep her clean, debt-free home in Scottsdale without any complications. She looked at my geology degree and saw a girl who played in the dirt. What she didn't see was that the same education showing me what was wrong with that 90-acre parcel also showed me exactly what was sitting right next to it. There is a 140-acre parcel of privately owned land directly adjacent to the contaminated site. The survey data I had pulled years earlier showed that the geology of that adjacent parcel, pristine, never mined, had the same base formation as several productive natural gas plays in the region. Tight sandstone at the right depth and porosity. Additionally, the soil composition was rich in a specific high-purity kaolin clay, increasingly in demand for advanced battery manufacturing, two industries converging on one piece of ground. I had checked the county records before I drove up. That parcel was held in a private land trust that had recently filed for dissolution. It would be listed for sale within 90 days. I drove back to Austin the next morning. I had 30 days and a plan. I paid the $65,000 county tax bill in full within the week. Keeping the contaminated LLC active was the first critical step. As long as taxes were current, the parcel and its federal liabilities would remain attached to the company name, rather than triggering immediate forced resolution. I had consulted an environmental attorney who confirmed that as long as I made no operational decisions and took no remediation actions that could be construed as acceptance of original liability, I had a narrow but real window of protection. I was not the polluter. I needed to be meticulous about what I did and did not do with that entity. The same week I paid the taxes, I filed registration paperwork for a brand new LLC, Osage Mineral Holding LLC, using a registered agent service so my name didn't surface in any public-facing filings immediately. I put 2 years of accumulated savings into the new entity's operating account. Then I made a cash offer on the 140-acre adjacent parcel. The land trust accepted within 3 weeks. The acquisition closed quietly. What followed was 14 months of concentrated work. I retained a licensed drilling geologist to co-sign the initial survey filings. I submitted a mineral rights lease proposal to 3 E&P companies operating in the Arkoma Basin, along with technical data supporting the natural gas formation. Within 6 months, one of them, a mid-size independent operator, executed a lease agreement and began preliminary drilling on a portion of the acreage. The royalty structure I negotiated was based on what I knew the geology was actually worth, not what I needed. The kaolin situation took longer. I commissioned independent laboratory testing and submitted those results to 2 battery materials manufacturers. One of them, a company in Nevada supplying a major EV battery producer, came back with a letter of intent. They wanted a 5-year exclusive arrangement for the kaolin supply. The numbers in that letter made my hands shake slightly when I read them. I didn't build anything showy. I renovated a small farmhouse on the property's eastern edge, set up a proper home office, and hired 2 people. Ruth Ann, a field operations coordinator with 15 years of land management experience, and Ike, a contracts manager who had previously handled procurement for an oil field services firm. Both of them were paid well because they were worth it. I blocked my mother's number the same week I moved in. I blocked my sister. I blocked my brother-in-law. 14 months of total professional silence. And it was the most productive silence of my life. I didn't know exactly when they found out. I learned later how it happened. My brother-in-law had put money, Tamara's money, and funds from a second mortgage on the Scottsdale house that he hadn't fully disclosed to her, into a private logistics venture that failed. He needed capital urgently. He convinced my mother to call me. I know this because she called from her landline, which I hadn't thought to block, and I answered out of sheer curiosity to hear how far the desperation had gone. She didn't ask how I was. She launched directly into a prepared speech about family and sacrifice and temporary financial difficulty. She told me my brother-in-law was on the verge of a significant business recovery and simply needed a short-term bridge of $75,000. She suggested I take out a loan against the Oklahoma property. I asked her whether Tamara and my brother-in-law had considered selling the Scottsdale house if they needed that much liquidity that urgently. My mother's voice went sharp. She said the house was not a financial instrument to be liquidated and that it represented Tamara's security and stability. She told me I had always been jealous of my sister and this was simply more evidence. She worked herself into a genuine fury over about 45 seconds and then I ended the call. What happened next I pieced together later from what Tamara told me after everything had already collapsed. My brother-in-law went online to find leverage. He was looking for a foreclosure filing or a county delinquency notice, something he could use to force my hand. What came up instead was a 2-page feature in a regional energy industry publication. The headline read, "Quiet Operator: How One Young Geologist Turned an Overlooked Oklahoma Parcel into a Multi-Sector Revenue Engine." The article quoted the drilling company's project lead, calling the natural gas formation a meaningful find, mentioned the kaolin supply agreement without disclosing the full terms, and estimated the combined value of my operation somewhere between $6 and $9 million. There was a photograph of me in a field jacket, standing outside the farmhouse with survey equipment behind me. He read that article and did what people like him always do. He didn't think, "She built something, and it's hers." He thought, "That land came from our family and she's been keeping it from us." He took the article to my mother. My mother looked at the photograph and concluded, exactly as I had anticipated she would, that the farmhouse and the drilling site were sitting on the same 90 contaminated acres she had handed me in that conference room. She decided I had somehow remediated the site and built an empire on top of what she'd given me. She called the result her investment. She called my business the family legacy. They drove up in my brother-in-law's new truck, a $95,000 crew cab he had financed through a private lender at a punishing interest rate against the projected value of what he believed he was about to take ownership of, and arrived at my gate on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead. The gate was open for a supply delivery. They drove straight up the gravel road and parked in front of the farmhouse. I was in the east field when my security camera sent an alert. I watched on my phone as my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law stepped out of the truck. I watched him walk the perimeter of the farmhouse with his arms crossed like he was already measuring what he owned. I finished what I was doing, then I drove back. When I came through the back door, my brother-in-law was at my desk, helping himself to my chair, looking through the paperwork on the surface with no expression of discomfort whatsoever. My mother was in the kitchen inspecting the appliances. My sister was on the couch, not meeting anyone's eyes. He turned when I came in and began talking like we were already mid-conversation. He said the operation was more impressive than he'd expected. He said he had reviewed the visible documents on my desk and the revenue figures were solid. He said that since the original land had come from our father, this was family equity, and the fair structure going forward would be for him to step in as operating partner. He'd handle the financial oversight. I could continue in a technical consulting role if I wanted to stay involved. He said it the way men like him always say things, with the calm certainty that the room will simply rearrange itself. I told him I understood his position and was open to discussing the business structure. I said I just wanted him to have full visibility into all the liabilities before making any decisions. I told him I'd pull the master file for the holding company so he could review it in its entirety. I went to my filing cabinet and removed a red binder. It contained the complete documentation for the original LLC my mother had handed me, the entity tied to the 90 contaminated acres. The company name was deliberately generic, Southwest Land Holdings, LLC. The binder had the deed, the county tax receipts showing current payment, and the original property summary. It looked, to someone not looking carefully, like the foundational document of a prosperous operation. He took it without saying thank you. They stayed for 6 days, and yes, I let them. I need you to understand why, because it's the part that's easiest to judge from outside. I let them stay because I needed my brother-in-law to sign the company transfer documents voluntarily in front of a notary with full opportunity to ask questions. If I had called the police and had them removed, there would have been a restraining order and a legal dispute and nothing else. People who believe they've already won sign documents. People who feel cornered do not. I needed him to feel like he was winning right up until the pen left the paper. So I let them stay. I was polite. I answered questions at the surface level. I let my brother-in-law walk my property acting like he owned it, because every day he did that he grew more certain that he did. I watched my mother tell Ruth Ann, who has a business degree from Oklahoma State and has been managing land operations contracts for 12 years, that the filing system needed to be reorganized. Ruth Ann smiled and said she'd take a look at it. I told Ruth Ann privately that same evening that she could take the rest of the week paid and ignore anything she was asked to do by our guests. On the 5th evening, my brother-in-law came to me with a transfer agreement his attorney had drafted. He wanted me to sign over full ownership and voting rights of Southwest Land Holdings, LLC, to him immediately. He had named himself incoming CEO. He told me I could remain as a geological consultant at a salary he would determine at a later date. I told him I needed one day to review it with my own attorney. He agreed because he was so certain of his position that one day felt like a courtesy he could afford to extend. I called Miss Park, my attorney who had filed every document in Osage Mineral Holdings since the beginning, and gave her one instruction: prepare the clean transfer of Southwest Land Holdings, LLC to my brother-in-law, with the full liability assumption clause on page 1, and schedule the signing for Friday morning. We met in her office across town. My brother-in-law arrived in the new truck wearing a suit. My mother wore her good coat. My sister looked like she hadn't slept well. Miss Park placed the transfer documents on the table and read the material terms aloud as required. She read clearly that the incoming owner was assuming all assets, all liabilities, all pending regulatory obligations, and all existing federal enforcement actions associated with Southwest Land Holdings, LLC, effective upon signing. He waved his hand and said he understood. I asked him once, directly, calmly, looking him in the face, whether he had reviewed the environmental disclosure section in the binder I had given him. He looked at me the way people look at someone they've already decided is no longer relevant. He said his people had reviewed the financials and everything was in order. He signed. Miss Park notarized it. The transfer was complete. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a single key on the table. Old brass, on a worn plastic tag with the property address in fading marker. I told him that was the key to the main gate of his new property. I told him Southwest Land Holdings, LLC held the deed to a 90-acre former surface coal mine in LaFleur County, with 11 active EPA violation flags and a federal consent order for approximately $1.1 million in mandatory environmental remediation costs. I told him the farmhouse, the drilling operation, the kaolin supply agreement, and the natural gas royalties all belonged to a completely separate entity, Osage Mineral Holdings, LLC, which I had registered 14 months ago and which he had never held any interest in. I told him the address on the tag was where he should go to inspect what he'd just acquired. Then I thanked Miss Park, picked up my bag, and walked out. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat on the front step of the farmhouse and watched the morning light move across the east field, while, about 40 miles away, my brother-in-law was driving his $95,000 truck down a county gravel road toward a rust-colored, chemically scorched piece of land with federal warning signs bolted to a gate that the key in his hand would open. The EPA had been waiting for a responsive owner. His signing of the transfer documents triggered an automatic notification through the Federal Corporate Registry. By the time he arrived at the property, an EPA field team was already en route. They met him at the gate. They confirmed his identity. They confirmed the ownership transfer and his explicit acceptance of all associated liabilities. When he became agitated and claimed he had been deceived, the lead officer explained, without particular emotion, that all 11 violations had been publicly listed in the EPA's enforcement database for years, that the liability assumption clause in the signed and notarized document was unambiguous, and that his immediate options were to engage a qualified environmental remediation contractor or face additional federal enforcement action. The private lender who had financed the truck called the loan when they discovered the company he had pledged as collateral was encumbered by federal cleanup obligations worth more than 7 figures. The second mortgage he had quietly taken on the Scottsdale house became the subject of a separate legal proceeding when those details reached my sister. She filed for divorce 7 weeks later. My mother spent a significant portion of her remaining savings on attorneys, trying to argue that I had misrepresented the company during the transfer. Those arguments did not succeed because I had not misrepresented anything. The transfer documents named the entity explicitly. The liability clause was on the first page in plain language. My brother-in-law had been offered the opportunity to review everything and had declined. After the second attorney told her there was no viable claim, she stopped calling. Some time has passed now. Ruth Ann and Ike are still with me. The gas royalties have been steady, the Cowlin agreement renewed with improved terms. I bought a small adjacent parcel that has a creek running through it, not because I needed the acreage, but because I wanted to be able to walk somewhere quiet in the evenings when the work is done. I talk to my sister occasionally. It is careful and infrequent and has the quality of two people who share a history they are both still figuring out how to carry. I don't know what that becomes over time. I'm not holding my breath and I'm not closing the door. What I know is simpler than any of that. My mother handed me poison and labeled it an inheritance. She did it deliberately with a smile in a conference room because she looked at my life and decided I was the most convenient person to absorb the damage. She thought a geology degree was a hobby and a condemned mining parcel was a burden. She didn't know that I had spent 4 years learning to read what the earth holds underneath the surface of things. The land tells you everything, you just have to know how to listen. If someone has ever handed you a weight they were certain would drown you, I want you to know that the weight itself is sometimes the exact thing that shows you what you're capable of. Not every inheritance is money. Sometimes it's a problem dressed up as a gift, and the only question is whether you have the skill to see what's actually underneath it. I do. My name is Layla, and I built every single thing I have on ground that someone else was certain would be my end.